Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Open Democracy's live weekly panel discussion. I'm Remi Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. Open Democracy exists to challenge power and inspire change, and we do awesome journalism to achieve that. I am broadcasting this week from Louisville, Kentucky. As you can see, there's a very elegant picture of the Ohio River in the background. I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky, and I've been traveling across the key swing states of Pennsylvania and Ohio for the past few days, talking to voters from all over the country in the last few weeks and months. And I've been writing and tweeting about what I found. You can follow me at Mary Fitz, that's MaryFTZ on Twitter. And we can share some of the links to some of the reporting that myself and my colleagues have been doing around this pivotal moment. I'm really delighted to introduce an absolutely fantastic panel today. We have David Korn, who's the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of Mother Jones. He's an analyst for MSNBC too, and he's co-author of the New York Times #1 best-selling book, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. I'm delighted to be joined by Lydia Namubiru, who's our Africa editor based in Kampala, and who played a critical role in this week's major dark money investigation, and by Remi Bak, who is policy officer at the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, and a key contact and ally in many of our work. So I'll start with some housekeeping. Thanks to everyone who's joining us. You can participate in the chat on Zoom or on Facebook. Please forgive any technical hitches, interruptions, pets, children, etc. These things sometimes happen. I just want to thank all the panelists for being here today. And I'm going to start with David. David, you've been you're in the eye of the storm for this election, and I'd love to hear your perspective, particularly on what we might be missing in this race. What are the key themes or issues or perspectives that actually the blanket media coverage is not picking up on? And what does this tell us about where we are at this moment, and what you think will happen not only next week, but beyond next week?
Well, as you say, there's been blanket coverage, and a lot has focused on the race, as it often does, in a binary fashion: who's going to win, who's going to lose. And I think it's important to note in the American system that we are still very much a, not 50-50 country, a 45-45 country. I mean, the fact that Donald Trump can preside over a government that has watched almost 250,000 Americans die because of an inept and incompetent response to a pandemic and still be competitive tells you a lot. I mean, he walks into this race, with 40% of a lock. I'm often amazed when I look at your homeland and parliamentary democracies in Europe and elsewhere, when you can have these gigantic swings in parliament from like a 65-35 to 35-65, and one party just comes sweeping in. In America, we really are stuck kind of in the midfield, going back and forth a little bit over that midfield line. And even a pandemic of historic proportion that has left tens of millions of Americans out of work while killing so many and having this awful, horrific impact on millions of families still doesn't change some of the basic fundamental dynamics of American politics. So, Trump is, by all polling measures, is trailing at the moment. The polls are probably more or less correct, but also people believe the race, as often happens in the end, is tightening up. So he still has a chance of winning. But whatever happens on Tuesday, and we may not know Tuesday, it may take days, if not weeks, to sort it out, if it is indeed close, we're still going to have a political, cultural civil war ongoing in the United States. All the resentments, the bigotry, the hatred, the racism that Trump has raised up to support his own political career is not going to go away. America, if it votes against Trump and repudiates him, there still will be, 60, 65 million Americans who vote for him, who will be left standing with their anger and their positions that they had going into the election. So Trump is not, not the disease. He's more of a symptom. He's more of the manifestation. So this election is, of course, historic, most consequential election of our lifetime. We've all heard this, this cliche. It's kind of true at this moment in time, but it's, it won't be the end. If he wins, it's not the end of Trumpism. And if he loses, it's not the end of Trumpism either. It might be the beginning of the end, but it won't be the end.
That's an interesting point to pick up on. The last thing you said. I was speaking with Brian Hughes, who's an expert on far-right militias and militia movements in the United States. And he said his big concern is if, for example, there's a Biden landslide, that we could become complacent, people can become complacent about the threat of far-right and extremist politics. And what he actually fears is that a far more competent and effective far-right leader could emerge within the next 4 to 8 years. And I talk about this in a piece I wrote the other day as well, that plays on these sort of foundational myths of American freedom and the sort of American kind of settler colonial identity far more effectively than Trump has. Trump is not,
oh yeah, I mean,
Trump is not smart, right? In many ways, and I think that's really concern. Yeah, tell me more about that.
No, a lot of us have been thinking about this for actually since the beginning of Trump's election, since he won, in that he's not smart. He's sly. He's wily. He has good instincts and good reflexes when it comes to being a showman and a demagogue. He knows how, he has that type of demagogic intelligence, but he's not smart in terms of understanding policy or being able to come up with strategy. And you look at this whole campaign, he hasn't done one smart thing. Maybe he'll win. I don't want to say, he won't. And then we'll all say he's a genius. But all he had to do was show an ounce of empathy for the millions of Americans who are being affected by the pandemic. He had the ability to use basically free money to send out relief, in the last couple of weeks to people suffering from the pandemic recession. And he didn't do that. If he just, and he can't because, this is a psychological, deficit for him. But if he could have just, contained his hatred, his bigotry, his obnoxiousness, his rudeness at the first debate. I mean, these things, if he was smart and where he was calculating, he could be in a much better position now. And then we look at, the Republicans out there. There's a senator from Arkansas named Tom Cotton and others who have been trying to sort of get into Trump's wake, ride behind him, draft behind him. If you're thinking of bicycle riders who are ready to, when Trump falters, to shoot out ahead, right? And so there are people out there who want to play the same sort of divisive, demagogic, norm-shattering politics, who actually are more calculating, not as obnoxious personally, and understand, that if you accept some of the rules and put on the right show, that you can win people over and, bring back some of the people that Trump's antics may have alienated. So it goes back to, what I said a moment ago, this election is not going to change the basic fundamentals of American politics right now. And we will still be left, if Trump loses, with tens of millions of Americans ready to follow a demagogue who wants to be an authoritarian and who uses racist and misogynistic rhetoric and policies in order to get ahead. So that they're going to be ripe for the picking, right? They're going to be there.
What would change the fundamentals of American politics?
Oh gosh, that's really a big question. That's a long-term project. I mean, part of it is demographics. And a lot of the Trumpian base are older and whiter Americans. Some of them are whiter as well, and mainly male. And they are dying off at a faster rate than other portions of the public. And the younger generation, which is far more diverse in ethnicity, in ideas, far more tolerant, are not good, good prospects for the Republicans. So this might be the last hurrah of a certain slice of America, but that's only a slice. That's there's still a lot of people out there who will remain. And I think, what might have to happen is there needs to be a bit of a shift in the political culture in which the Democrats, if they need to figure out how to reach people who feel they've been cut out of Washington in terms of economic policies. Now, that still will leave people who care more about cultural matters, about immigration, about abortion, and so on. I mean, you're not going to win them over. People who want America to be a white country, you're not going to win them back. They're going to fight for that. They're going to go down fighting. People who care mostly about abortion and social conservatism and still don't like gay marriage, and you're not going to win them back. But there are some people who are part of that coalition who might be won back if you can show them that you care about them when it comes to jobs, healthcare, education, rebuilding our infrastructure. So, the goal would be over the long term to minimize that Trumpian base, to make it into a group of people who are diehard, hardcore, social conservatives or bigots, whatever you want to call them, and just sort of say, okay, that's part of America, but they are isolated. The rest of us can try to get together and have, decent disagreements and debates about how we can handle the other problems we have. It's a long-term prospect, that may not even be the best answer one can come up for this, but we're a big country with a lot of issues, and it's like a super tanker. When they make a turn, it takes them miles and miles to make a turn. They can't just decide to turn. So what I'm hoping for on this election day is at least a nudge in the right direction.
Thank you. And the reason that we're all here from all over the world, both our panelists and our audience are watching intently this super tanker that and those who are trying to turn it around, is because, of course, the outcome of this election and indeed the direction of American politics going forward has profound implications for the rest of us all over the world. Many millions and millions of people don't get to vote in this election, but it materially and directly affects women, many women across the world who will access health and reproductive services if there's a Democratic president that they won't. If there's a Republican president, it could affect the future air, the quality of the air we breathe, because if there's a Democratic president, you have the Paris Climate Change Accord, and you have multilateral agreements and commitments which change the game in terms of tackling climate change. And I'd love to, at this point, bring in Remi, because one of the things that Open Democracy has done this week is release the results of a large and global investigation, which shows how money from a number of the particularly religious conservative groups and organizations and movements that have been backing Trump and that indeed were powerful long before Trump, how that money is now being spent in critical battles against human rights and against democracy in other parts of the world. So Remi, I'd love to hear your perspective on what you found most shocking or most important or most revealing about the major global investigation that Open Democracy released this week, which revealed that over $280 million that we know of has flowed from these a handful of small, powerful organizations all over the world.
Thank you. I think the most shocking for me is the total amount of money which is spent in Europe from the ultra-conservative organizations from US. But also, if we look about on the years when the spending was the highest, it also we can find out easily that these are years of important elections in Europe. 2015 elections in Poland, 2014 in various Eastern European countries, 2016 Western European countries. This money has definitely very strong impact on elections at the time in Europe. It's maybe danger to draw some direct links and connections. The further investigation is needed, but conclusions which we can potentially draw can be very terrifying for us, if I can use such a strong word.
Well, indeed, I wanted to ask you that specifically. So for
Yeah.
our international audience, I mean, there are some very clear cause and effect examples, right? You could even explain exactly the court case that happened in Poland and these groups' involvement in that and other rights to do with LGBT people that paint the picture of how this is actually directly affecting people's lives.
Yeah, so I was lucky I can give you first-hand relation from Poland. I was lucky to be in Poland just before the second wave of COVID. It was 2 weeks ago. I was in direct contact, I'm still in direct contact with Women's Strike, we was working there. Poland is the brightest example of the cultural war going on in Poland. Like we know for the last almost week now, Poland is a witness of huge, massive protests against tightening of the abortion law. The current conservative government, which won elections in 2015, as I mentioned, which is a probably result, was one of the results of the financing coming from the US. I'm just guessing at the moment. And since then, try to introduce very conservative policies, try to impose a conservative style of life on the I would say, rather liberal society. We can easily, I would like to also agree with this, continuing my speech, I would like to agree with this, what David said, whatever the protests we finish or whatever be done we will the elections, the basics of these findings and the basic fundamentals of Europe and US will not change. The fight and struggle will continue. And we're observing this continuous war over next years. This money have massive and huge impact of life of every single person in Europe. And I think this is the most important finding of this research. And we need to continue our cooperation with journalists, academics, parliamentarians, journalists to spread awareness how big this movement is and how potential huge impact it has.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to come now to Lydia, because Lydia, you worked on this investigation directly, and you looked particularly at the way that this Christian conservative money has been spent in Africa and the kind of causes that it's backed. But of course, it's not just the money, right? So paint the picture of what you found across Africa, and again, in the context of the decision facing US voters. Tell us what you found about these groups, many of whom have strong links to the Trump administration, and how they're operating in Africa. You're on mute, Lydia.
Yeah, before we even talk about these groups, it's I think important for the world to appreciate that a conservative government in the US has always had huge impact on women in the developing world. Through the well-known global gag rule, but that this conservative government in the US is not even a normal conservative government. That rule was expanded significantly by the Trump administration. So you already
explain just to people what the global gag rule is for everyone to understand.
Right. So the global gag rule used to be a rule that applied to USAID funding, that if you couldn't get an organization, health provider couldn't get USAID funding if they also either provided abortion services or even referred women or gave them information on abortion. And that is not, it wasn't that if you couldn't use USAID money for that, it's that if you did it, even with your own funds, even with funds from other donors, you couldn't do it. You were cut out of USAID funding. And it's something nearly every, it's something nearly every conservative, president in the US has signed into law, usually in the first 100 days of their presidency. But what happened under Donald Trump is that it was expanded well beyond USAID funding. It now applies to almost all public funding from the US. So there was that. And you see, people tend to think about it as something that disrupts abortion services. But these services are often provided in an integrated manner. People people who see pregnant women also see HIV positive people, also provide HIV testing. And so when their funding is cut, all of those services are all of those services are disrupted. In Togo and Liberia, they weren't able to find other organizations that could provide that service once they cut the funding to International Planned Parenthood, which does advise on abortion. And those services expand way beyond abortion. It's contraceptives, it's HIV/AIDS service. So that's there. A conservative government in the US is always a threat to the healthcare rights of women in the developing world, especially the poorest who need service that is subsidized. And that then Donald Trump's is not even an ordinary conservative government. It's a conservative government on steroids. So there's that. Then outside of the US government, we've had a growing interest in Africa from ultra-conservative Christian organizations that started to be really, really active with the George W. Bush Jr. Presidency, who gave them sort of an injection of cash under PEPFAR to provide abstinence, to advise people who were at risk of HIV to simply not have sex, abstain from sex. And that's been growing ever since. So what our investigation that we're releasing this week reveals is that these organizations have spent more than $50 million in Africa. I mean, about 54, and that's just the money that we know of. Their reporting isn't consistent. It's definitely not the full amount in Africa. Now, when you look at what they've been doing, the sort of causes they've been associated with, the individuals they've been associated with, is really extreme homophobia. It's people who have, it's a very extreme take on abortion and reproductive health rights. You have them supporting crisis pregnancy centers that in countries where abortion is already illegal, so they have nothing to fight against. These crisis pregnancy centers are advising women against modern contraception. And they're targeting teenagers, and that's what US right money supports. US Christian right money supports. You have had them support the most virulent homophobes, people who have campaigned for gay people to be killed, officially associates of these organizations. And that's the thing I suppose the rest of us needs to notice is progress elsewhere kind of pushes people, when we're speaking, extremism runs to the margins, and Africa is seen as that margin, and therefore Africans become the grass that's, that's crushed in that global dynamic, or we can no longer do this in the US. We can no longer do this in Europe. If we try to do this in Europe, we'll face stiff resistance. We will trigger protests. So they move further and further in their mind, further and further to the margins where that kind of resistance is not going to be seen.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you this because there's sort of two different perspectives here. There's the perspective of regardless of who wins the next election, the election next week, right? Whoever the next president is, these religious, conservative, dark money funded, US-based organizations are going to continue pushing extremist agendas on Africa and on Latin America. Pushing for unbelievably restrictive and punitive anti-abortion laws, anti-LGBT laws, which are unbelievably harsh and unimaginable in a American, North American or European context. And that will happen regardless of who's president of the United States. And in some ways, if you have a more liberal president in the United States, there's less ground, there's less opportunity to push for those kinds of, those culture wars in the US. So there's an argument that that groups like this will redouble their efforts in other parts of the world where there's less scrutiny and less challenge. On the other hand, as you say, who the next president is matters massively millions of women and others who rely on health services across Africa. David, I wanted to bring you back in here because I feel as though very little of that perspective gets into the US media and debate, and the horse race punditry that is across the airwaves in this country at the moment, and in newspapers and online, doesn't really focus or think about the impact on the rest of the world at all, and may narrowly focus on some foreign policy questions. But even that is kind of striking for its absence. You're on mute.
I'm unmuting. Are you saying you want Americans to think about how we affect the rest of the world? I mean, come on. I mean, how long have you been waiting for that to happen?
My whole life. Having been born in the United States, moved to London when I was 3, I've been waiting for this my whole life.
Well, Mary, I can give you many things. I'm not sure I can give you that. We are largely a myopic society. We believe in American, that we're an exceptional society, regardless of some evidence to the contrary. And it is, and we're a big country with a lot of things, that keep us internally focused. And there's a lot of mythology within America. So these are all impediments to really thinking too much. I mean, we can't even, it's hard to have an honest conversation even about climate change, which obviously impacts the rest of the world, what we do here, as well as what happens in China and India and other nations. That it's, I don't think Americans who, tend to vote less and therefore may be more apolitical than other Western democracies are going to be able to sort of broaden their horizons enough to factor in these inputs when they're thinking about the formation of their leadership here. I mean, Donald Trump has certainly raised people's awareness about the power of government and the importance of politics and voting more so than other presidents have done in the past. And I think there's more engagement. His standing or lack thereof in the world is, a piece of this election debate, not a big one, but is indeed a piece of it. But it's just very, the notion that there are American dark money groups that are screwing around with countries in Lydia's continent or Remi's continent, and financing, political conservatism and right-wing radicalism. It's something that we at Mother Jones and the New York Times and the Washington Post will cover, but isn't, I think, widely known. I will say this, if you're looking for a drop of optimism here, I'll try to give you this, Mary. And that is, we see, that there was an effort on the part of Steve Bannon, Trump's chief strategist, to kind of export Trumpian populism around the world and make alliances in Europe and in other places too, between his form of Trump conservatism and nationalism, some might call it proto-fascism, in other places. And they get together, they have their meetings, they have their conferences. He gets together with the Brexit guys in England, but I don't see this effort truly taking off. It's true, Marine Le Pen remains a force in France and in Germany and in other nations. The right-wing parties are still there, but this idea, this goal that Bannon and to a lesser degree Trump had of sort of banding together in an organized, smart way hasn't happened. We still see this tendency towards authoritarianism in Hungary and in Turkey and other places, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump being buddies with all these other autocrats. That's still happening. But their ability to, I think, to congeal and form a true alliance, or what we might call an axis of evil, seems to be somewhat impeded. It may still may come to pass, but so to that extent, there is a slight degree of optimism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Steve Bannon was, I think, always a bit like Cambridge Analytica, more talk than trousers. But I do think that so the axis of evil point is well made, and I do agree with that. However, what our journalism has uncovered and revealed is that you don't necessarily have to have close or formal political alliances to get things done. I mean, Remi, having just visited Poland, you know, the one of the groups that we were looking at and we investigated, who that's their chief counsel is Jay Sekulow, who is Trump's top lawyer and is getting ready to fight all over the United States against the results of the elections next week. You know, his group has been filing amicus briefs for court cases again, trying to restrict abortion and pushing back on LGBT rights. And you know, it's the financing and the resourcing of the arguments that are made in courts, the lobbying that goes on behind the scenes, the kind of framing and strategy and tactics, which don't necessarily have to come from the top, but they come from civil society groups that are aligned with a particular worldview. And I think what we're seeing in Europe and in Africa and Latin America, but specifically speaking from the European context, is that it's quite cheap and it can be very easy to have that kind of influence and that kind of impact in countries where you're talking about far less amounts of money in terms of lobbying, and far I guess we're just not used to these type of operations, and we're sort of behind the curve in terms of thinking, in terms of understanding the way that these organizations operate and their agenda and their tactics and their strategies. So I think I agree with you in this sort of formal political sense, but there are many other ways of making change happen and making change happen quickly. I think Poland basically effectively outlawed abortion in almost all cases last week, and there were American groups directly involved in pushing for that. So I think that's part of the picture. The other thing, which you said, and I think this is true, you were joking, you can't imagine Americans care what happens in the rest of the world, but it's really interesting, and people are asking me, what am I seeing and hearing on the ground? What I'm really struck by when I speak to people who are both far to the right and quite far to the left, is this same sense of, I guess, isolationism, or a kind of, as you say, a myopic perspective. On the right, a lot of the people I speak to who are going to vote for Trump like him because he hasn't started wars, he's brought troops home, you know, he's de-escalated conflicts. They think he de-escalated the Iran conflict. You know, he's doing things for Middle East peace, but critically, for them, America first is, you know, we are pulling back from the rest of the world, and we're going to fight the fights we need to fight with China and whoever else to get the deal we need. But we aren't going to be involved in the rest of the world in the way that previous presidents have sought to be. And on the left, and what I hear from a lot of race and social justice activists is, from our perspective, there's no difference between Trump and Biden, because Biden was, you know, Biden and Harris, Kamala Harris, were responsible for policies which unfairly and unjustly incarcerated millions of African-American men. And so to us, it's that, you know, there is no choice. They are the same candidates. And while I understand that perspective, that ignores the rest of the world, right? And the effects that the American presidency has on the rest of the world. So I was really struck by the isolationism, which has long been a feature of American culture, right? But on both sides of the political spectrum, which I found really disheartening, actually. And
to your last point, it not just ignores, you know, the rest of the world, it ignores people at home, because it's clear that if you don't like the position that Joe Biden took in 1994 on a criminal justice bill, which also had funding for social programs. I mean, it wasn't just locking them up. It was a gigantic compromise bill that had terrible things and good things, like often legislation has. If you don't like that, you know, by voting, if you don't vote for Biden, you're telling American women, low-income women, we're going to take abortion away from you. You're telling people we're going to give tax cuts to the rich and see low-income Americans who need health care struggle. So it's not just the rest of it. It's being very narrow-minded and myopic. And I do believe, while there's always been the sense on the left that, the Democrat and the Republican, there's no difference and it doesn't really matter. I think 2000, if you go back to Bush and Gore and you look at issues like climate change in the Supreme Court, you see there was a tremendous difference. You fast forward to 2016 and you see there was a tremendous difference. Electing Hillary Clinton and electing Donald Trump made a world difference in many ways. In how we partly in how we engage in the rest of the world too, and whether we give a damn about the rest of the world. There's always been this debate or this internal, push and pull in American political culture between imperialism and isolationism, and interventionism, and America first, screw the rest of the world. And there are elements of both of those polar opposites on each side of the political divide. So you go to America First in the 1930s, and it was people who were sympathetic to Nazi Germany who didn't want FDR getting us in a war to help you guys over there. And that was the isolationists. And it was the progressives who said, no, we should be interventionists to fight fascism and defend liberal democracy. Of course, that all shifts later in Vietnam and things flip back and forth. But now you have Trump in this odd position where, he claims to be against wars abroad, I think in part because he just doesn't give a damn. But he wants to get the oil as well. And he's just kind of makes a mess of things, but he talks a good game by just saying, I'm not going to do anything. And so things get worse with North Korea in terms of nuclear proliferation. But he claims that he solved the problem. And his people, in a cultish way, accept that. So, I think some people look at him and say, yeah, he's kept us out of wars. And, but the last big war we had still was not a democratic war. Barack Obama kept us out of wars too. It's a very complicated issue, but what you're picking up on, a lot of people who want to believe in Trump and are just repeating whatever he says. But I think the overall point is that this time around, at least on the left, people realize that you don't have the luxury, most people, not everybody, luxury of wanting a pure progressive candidate. That it's popular front time if you know your history. Everybody who's center, left of center, and even right of center, who see Trump as a threat to America, to the world, to democracy, band together now, vote him out, and then have all the fights that we like to have about what to do in terms of intervention overseas or isolationism and tax policy and all that. So I expect there will be a big turnout on Tuesday that will reflect the fact that people who might have sat this out feel they can't do that this time. Thank you.
And that point about the global perspective links nicely to what Diana Carboni, who's one of our Latin America editors, is asking, and this is a question for you, Remi. She says, how could change in the US presidency affect the ultra-conservative lobby in global governance institutions like the UN? Because that's another point about the relevance of who the next president is, right? What happens in those multilateral global institutions? What's the difference between a Republican and a Democrat? And it'd be great if you could answer that, Remi.
Yes, of course. So picking up on this question, I would like to start with, we have to remember just 7 days ago, US, together with its allies, signed up and created basically Geneva Consensus, which is in direct contradiction with sexual health reproductive rights, stands in direct contradiction with sexual health reproductive rights. Well, if Democrats will win upcoming elections, they basically the anti-choice, anti-gender movements around the world, they will lose their leader. It will be a significant punch for them. Like it will be, they will lose their center, their core support in their policies around the world. Moreover, the governments, Eastern European governments with democracies and institutions which are still shaping and stabilizing after 90s and switch from the communist system into the democracies, they will lose the support in the Republican Party, in the security. There is wide bouquet of things which will change if Democrats will win upcoming elections. Of course, it's difficult to predict how deep these changes will be, but certainly we can draw some very important changes. First of all, it's a security, which is very important for governments in both Hungary and Poland. They will have to deal with government which supports SRHR, supports LGBT rights, supports various different progressive politics. They don't have this issue now. The publicity, the voters in both countries also are likely to watch what is happening in US and often follow this direction. So, of course, this direction is very broad, and we can discuss in many aspects of upcoming elections, how David mentioned. But yeah, I think I give a few examples how the upcoming elections can impact the life of citizens in the EU, in Europe.
Thank you very much. And Lydia, I wanted to ask you that question. You've painted the picture of the way the different presidencies affect people's lives. How does it affect particular political calculuses? So are there, and you can take particular countries as an example if you like, but how does it change what African governments, what African leaders do, how they behave, what they consider?
Right. So in one of our stories, in the Africa story in particular, someone makes the point that this sort of conservative movement and conservative growth movement towards Africa is in many ways a battle for the UN. And I think the US state has a lot of power over how African states vote at the UN. So, and for a lot of African states, aligning yourself with the US is really, it's not a real choice. You know, very many African states are dependent on the US for funding for a lot of very important things, education, health. So they vote with the US, and in the part under Trump, the US has become a sort of minority whip in the UN, and but it does manage, even when they have really outrageous propositions, they do manage to get some countries on board. And when you look at those countries and their then aid relationships with those countries, you can see why those countries are aligning themselves with the US, even when sometimes those propositions are counter to what domestic policy is. So yeah, I think at least at the global international level, where the US goes, a lot of African and global South countries will go, because it's not a real choice. You have to align yourself with the US on some level to continue to benefit from its aid. So yes, and I do also think that the US used to be a sort of beacon for progressive, also a certain kind of democracy that can still be critiqued, but that seemed to work. And I do feel like Trump has legitimized a kind of figure, a kind of image of power that Africans sort of struggle a lot with. Strong men, autocracy, and we kind of tended to look towards this successful, very flawed, but going democracy that is the US. And I think it's been a big thing to lose. That sort of a good example, to a good flawed example, but to look at, and that Trump continuing to be in power continues to normalize what we have always thought to be wrong. We have always known to be wrong, and legitimizes African strongmen and autocracy and corruption and employing your relatives to state positions and sort of thing. Yeah.
Indeed, it sets the tone, doesn't it, as well as the substance.
That's one thing I wanted to comment on that, because I do think that's one of the tragedies of the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, I've long been a critic of American foreign policy, American domestic policy, but I do think there is an idea of America that has some marvelous components to it. the ideals that we talk about that we usually don't live up to, of democracy and liberty and civil liberties and free expression, free debate, all that stuff. I mean, I think there's a real component to the American story about those things. And I do believe that they provide some inspiration to people around the world. There is a reason why our Constitution is screwed up as it is often the model for new democracies. Hopefully they make improvements on our own problems. And what Trump has done is come along and not just sort of rip that up. He's acted like every other tin pot dictator around the world, and he has energized those who think this is a model. If you can do this in America, you can do this anywhere. And even why does Putin want to see this? Vladimir Putin wants to see this because, how can Americans challenge his failed elections and his repressive regime if we have a guy like Trump in power here? And we have seen, very specifically, Trump's war on the media, calling us the enemy of the people, and the whole fake news thing being used word for word by Erdogan in Turkey and Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines, in a way that puts journalists at physical risk, putting their lives in jeopardy. So, I collectively apologize, Lydia and Remi and Mary, to what he's doing, but he's totally ripping apart, the aspects of America that I think people did look to in a positive way. And that's one reason why this election will be consequential, at least on that surface level. If Americans repudiate him, that too will send a signal that maybe, we won't accept this, at least not for too long.
Thank you. And I wanted to sort of zero back in on that flawed American democracy for a moment and to sort of, zero in on the domestic focus again, because of course, a lot of the questions that people have been asking in this conversation and has been discussed by many people I've spoken to on the road is around the integrity of that electoral process, and also whether or not Trump will try and incite violence, whether there indeed will be violence at the polls. I spoke with a lady yesterday from rural Pennsylvania who said that she feels intimidated going to vote as a registered Democrat. She happens to be a registered Democrat. Spoke to a gentleman in New Jersey who can't vote because he's a convicted felon. Spoken to people on both sides of the political debate who feel as though, or fear that their votes might not be counted, or that there might be cheating and trickery around the margins. It's funny because, you speak, a range of Americans I've spoken to are both very proud of the ideals of their democracy, and at the same time have serious concerns and worries, many of them through lived experience, of the integrity of that democracy now. So I'd love you to speak to that, but also I want to ask you and to end with, really, what do you think is going to happen on polling day, and what do you think is going to happen immediately after polling day?
You're not paying me enough to give a prediction for Tuesday.
No, I don't want a prediction for Tuesday in terms of outcome, but what are you concerned about what will actually happen on the day?
Let's take a step back and look at the big picture for a moment. There were about 130 million votes cast in 2016. 130 million people voted in that election. If all systems have flaws and abuses and waste and problems, if you had 1% error rate with 130 million votes, that means 1.3 million votes are going to have problems. So we're going to get reports from across the country saying this machine didn't work. They didn't let me into this voting place. I got the wrong directions, or there were 3 guys with guns standing in front of this place, and I felt intimidated. Those things like that will happen. Things like that, maybe not the gun scenario, but things like that happen in every election. And so the question really is, to what degree is anything happening systematically to suppress votes and get in the way? We saw in the Georgia primary, Georgia being a state of the United States, a couple months ago, that they really cut down on polling places. They had long lines, primarily of Black voters, but not entirely Black voters, who had to wait 10, 11 hours. That was done on purpose. That was outrageous. Now, in some places, machines and systems will break down accidentally. It's important for people to understand that our election system here is not national. It's not even statewide. They run at the local level with different systems, different machines, different people in charge. Some places do it better than other places, which makes it hard for there to be one decision at the top that changes everything. But it does make it a mess. It's a collective mess of a lot of different smaller systems. And so I expect there will be different degrees of chaos in different places. We saw in 2000 that the vote was too close in Florida to get an accurate count. If you have 10 million votes and you're separated by 20 votes or so, it's hard to get an accurate count. People make mistakes in balloting. So there will be a lot of fuss. Now, Trump has already said the election is going to be rigged against him, right? He has said that there's no way he can lose if it's a real election, if it's an honest election. So he's being an autocrat, he's acting like a dictator, and so he's going to try to delegitimize the election as much as he can if he feels he's not winning. He's going to try to stop vote counting. A lot of votes are going to come in on election day through the mail system because of the pandemic, or in the next few days, which is allowed, and he's going to say, don't count those. And there may be court cases. He may run to court, try to stop counting. He may try, and there may be outside actors involved. I mean, Russia had a big influence on the 2016 election. We know that they are involved again now, that they've looked at some election systems, penetrated them to a certain degree with hackers. And so just imagine if they shut down. You're in Ohio, or you're in Kentucky, but let's say you go to Ohio and they turn off the grid, or somebody else, doesn't have to be Russia, they turn off the electric grid, and a key county in Ohio can't vote. Lights go out. What do? We don't really have a mechanism for dealing with that. There are no do-overs. Will judge say, well, we can vote tomorrow? Then there's a vote, the judge's decision get challenged. I mean, things could happen accidentally. There's a hurricane. There's a hurricane heading towards Louisiana and Texas.
We are in uncharted territory, I think, because we have a president who says they may not respect the result. So
I think if you have someone at the top saying that, it fuels everything. If you had someone at the top saying, I'm going to do the best I can and make sure we have a free and fair election. There will be issues. We're going to be responsible. We're going to work with states. I'm going to work with the other campaign and make sure. I mean, if you tamp it down from the top, the emotions and the divisiveness, it helps. But what he's doing is, lighting Molotov cocktails and throwing them into the barn while people are worried about a fire hazard. And so.
On that point, I just wanted to say, I mean, we've got a piece coming out tomorrow. We've been collaborating with David and Mother Jones on a piece that's coming out tomorrow about more about Trump's connections to other parts of the world. And I won't say more than that, but everyone knows what David's expertise is there. So do follow us and keep an eye on what's happening there. And I will be, as you mentioned, Ohio, I will probably be in Ohio on polling day itself. So do follow our coverage from the key swing states on the night itself. Lydia has to run because she's in high demand. She's got to go and speak to a South African news outlet now about the Tracking the Backlash investigation. But you wanted to say one final thing, Lydia.
Yes, David joked that we're expecting too much of Americans to care about their impact on the rest of the world. And I just wanted to say, Americans are not absent from the rest of the world. So they do, in fact, care. And we just want them to care about the nature of it. And I wanted people to go to the openDemocracy.net/tracking the backlash to start to understand what the nature of American presence in the rest of the world looks like, at least in one instant, in one way in which it looks like.
Lydia, do go and do your interview with the South African media outlet now. And Remi, did you have any final thoughts? Anything you want to just put in the minds of, I guess, American voters? We're not going to ask people to vote in one particular direction, but if there's any last comments you had to put in the mind of those who do face a choice on Tuesday, that would be wonderful.
You're still in a relatively good situation. Always you can look at Eastern European, what we have lost in 30 years. Vote accordingly, of course, with your conscience. You still have pluralistic, relatively good institutions, pluralistic media, all these things which we in Eastern Europe lost only through the last 30 years. So you're still in the relatively good situation, but the threat is always behind there. I think you and David has much better knowledge of US system than I do. I can only relate to Europe, and I can give you some examples. So yes, first of all, go do vote and do not be afraid of being intimidated. These things in Eastern Europe, you really have to fight to go to vote often. Like you could observe last elections in Poland, there were massive problems. People were queuing for hours to send one vote. So don't be afraid to go vote, even if there are guys with guns in front of the voting station.
Thank you so much. David, final word for you. And I'm not going to ask you to address your fellow Americans. I'm going to ask you to address the rest of the world. What do you want to say to the rest of the world at this moment?
Keep your fingers crossed. I mean, what's happening in the United States with the rise of Trumpism, we see I think there's a global trend here. We see a rise of criticism of liberal democracy, in part because in some instances it hasn't served everybody well. We also see it as a response to a rise in crises around the world that lead to the refugee crisis, and that presents challenges to national identity. And then we see people like Vladimir Putin and others trying to exploit these differences, and we saw that with Brexit in your fine land. So I'm hoping that people who care about democratic small d values, can fight their fights in their home and realize that we're kind of in this together. And the most important thing is, I think we got kind of lazy and sloppy. We think that once a country is established as a liberal democracy with rights, whether they're reproductive rights, freedom of expression, that you're kind of set. And then you fight about other things. But at least here in the United States, and I think we've learned the last 3-4 years that a lot of these are norms and not rules and not laws, and you got to fight for them kind of every day. You always be mindful of them, and if you don't, the other side is there ready to pounce.
Thank you. That's very much an insight and an impression and an experience that ricochets around the world. I think we've all learned that or felt that recently in recent years. So thank you, David. Thank you, Remi. Thank you to Lydia, who had to dash off for her other interview. And thank you to everyone who participated. Next week, we'll be discussing the outcome of the US election. Please do follow us at opendemocracy.net/newsletter if you're not already signed up. And if you think that discussions like this are important, please support us. We're not supported by dark money. So you can support us, and Julian will put that in the chat. It's support.opendemocracy.net/donate. Thank you, everyone. Fingers crossed for Tuesday, and we'll see you again next week.